We are reading about something new out of Africa. Out of Africa. We're actually reading about. Whoa, shit. Hopefully that. Did that pop up on screen? Hopefully not. We'll see. Um. We're reading about something new out of Africa. States made slaves. Slaves made states. This was published 2023 on the 18th of April by J.C. Sharman. Shout out J.C. Sharman, guys. Go check out J.C. Sharman's other shit. It's just it's oh damn. Bro does a lot about either bro or girl does a lot about slavery. It's I mean it's an under talked about topic. People just generally talk about it, but nobody like actually fucking reads about it. Especially about how um slavery was used in Africa. And we're gonna read about it now. I have kind of read this before. I tried to do like a recording before, and then I ended up like fucking it up. Like it was annoying, but now we're gonna reread it and probably have a better understanding. I actually even have some notes before I even start reading, just to make sure like what was old me thinking. Um Early African states were brittle and unstable. They relied on external resources to manage internal conflict. Their formation was heavily militaristic and insurrectionist. And then the slave economy existed in Africa for centuries before the industrial Atlantic slave trade. Those are all the notes I got. And I actually read about this literally 24 days ago. That's crazy, bro. That's crazy. But let's get into this reading. In this article, I explain a nexus between slavery and state formation in Africa, proceeding from initial demographic and institutional conditions to an external demand shift, individual state responses, and their collective systemic consequences. Historically, African rulers faced distinctive challenges. Low population density prioritized control of people more than territory, and internal disintegration was often a greater threat than external conquest. Ooh, niggas did not know how to run a state, bruh. Uh, a massive expansion in the demand for slaves offered African rulers increased opportunities to use external resources for outside in state building. Many did so by creating highly militarized predatory slaving states. The collective consequence was heightened systemic insecurity. Variation in the timing of these developments reflected regional and historical variation in the expansion of the demand for slaves. Slaving states appeared first in West Africa, reflecting the late 17th century expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, the famous one, before spreading to East Africa a century later. Following the parallel later increase uh what the fuck? Sorry. Uh Before spreading to East Africa a century later, following the parallel later in latter following the parallel later increase in the Indian Ocean slave trade. Oh, okay. If I would just finish the fucking sentence. Um it's essentially saying like kind of starting out in West Africa from the late 17th century, and then it spreads to East Africa, followed by an increase in the Indian Ocean. Uh, this outside in path to state formation both parallels and contrasts with contemporary post colonial state formation. It's funny because the outside in path to state formation is arguably kind of a state formation you can kind of see. I'm probably going to talk on my ass here, but you kind of see in like 1900s America almost in a sense, where the economy becomes more globalized and we start relying more on exports rather than no we start relying more on imports rather than exports. We like it, like the whole fucking saying where like we import a bunch of material and then we export culture. This is kind of similar, except for I guess they were importing material and then they were externalizing. They were exporting niggas. Wait, I just realized I can't even like make clips or I can't make clips or even probably get I'll probably get like demonetized and not prioritized if I'm saying the N-word. I just realized. Fuck. Fuck it, bro. Freedom of speech. Cause I made I made a I made a fucking short one time where I was like it was about like Islam or something and I think I said the N-word. No, it was actually it had Negro. I said Negro because I was like reading about Negro stuff and then literally I was like, why isn't this getting that many views? And I'm like, oh, maybe because they're not spreading it enough. But then you'll see some fucking reel where you ever seen the one of iRobot where like Will Smith is like, can a robot paint a beautiful canvas or create a beautiful tapestry? And then the robot goes, nigger. Yeah. So oh fuck. Okay, yeah. Now I'm really not gonna fucking whatever. Okay. That was the abstract. That was essentially this abstract was essentially explaining I mean what we're about to read. Essentially they're talking about how it's not just about how slavery kind of was how slavery existed as a market within Africa, but how it existed as like a literal like a state, like the state relied on this kind of slave market, you know. Between 1500 and 1850, 12 million enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas, while 2 to 3 million Europeans made the journey voluntarily, with vital political legacies that endure to this day. The slave trade, both from and within Africa, was highly consequential for both state formation and its systemic consequences. The argument presented here is based on a four-stage explanation, which moves from initial conditions to an external demand shift, to strategic responses to this shift, and finally to the interactive systemic consequences of these strategies. It is built on a foundation of highly insightful scholarship by area specialists and historians of Africa. Rather than being aimed at Africanists, what the fuck? Who the fuck are Africanists, bruh? Like people in Africa or people who research Africa? Is a specialist in African studies. Oh, okay, I see. Yes. Rather than being aimed at Africanists, however, the something new reference in the title is for scholars of international politics and state formation in advancing knowledge of international relations. So, yeah, this isn't about necessarily deep history of Africa, I guess. This is more so about international political history almost, and like state history. Uh, this was like the slave trade was a form of globalization that we don't really think about, like because or we kind of do. I mean, the Atlantic slave trade, like literally slaves being brought across vast oceans to be like fucking to produce work, you know? Drawing closely on a starting point provided by Herbst, the first stage of the explanation. Where should the sorry, I'm getting the survey out of the way. The first stage of the explanation is that African rulers tended to face different challenges from those in Europe. Low population density meant that control of scarce people was generally more difficult and more important than control of abundant land. Fission via the defection of vassals and tributary subrulers, and even whole populations simply decamping were often greater threats to these loose composite African states than external territorial conquests. Thus, as in many contemporary states in the developing world, anarchy was often more a domestic than an international problem. Second, although slaves and long distance slave trading existed in Africa for centuries before European contact, from the late 1600s, there was a massive expansion of transoceanic slave trade associated with the rise of the New World plantation economy. Yeah, so you see, like, when people are going to Americas and they were like, listen, bro, we don't want to build this shit ourselves, okay? Or we can't build this shit just alone. We need the blacks, please. We need the blacks to help us. Um, Slavery was we don't like to mention it, but slavery is a foundational building block of this nation. Um, and that's sad. I think that's sad. Some people don't think that's sad, which is a little crazy, but that is really sad. But it's funny because they were with the rise of the new world, in a way, like that was kind of the quote unquote old world in a way, at least relatively. The heightened demand for slaves continued even after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade from the time of the Napoleonic Wars, with the number of enslaved Africans peaking only in the late 19th century. The increase in demand for slaves was at first limited to Atlantic Africa, but from the early 19th century, it spread to Indian Ocean Africa. The export of slaves gave way to the export of slave-produced commodities, but this maintained the elevated demand for slaves. Third, as a result of this demand shift, the opportunity to amass new external resources via the slave trade provoked the rise of predatory states based on the militarized production of slaves. Expanded demand increased the returns to slave raiding for export relative to other economic activities. These states followed an outside-in logic of state building. Many African rulers mobilized external resources gained from supplying the expanded demand for slaves to counter internal threats to their physiparity. Oh, fuck. Dude, I read this word last time and I need to. Physiparis? No, it's like Physiparis, right? Let's see. Physiparis? Something that tends to break up in the smaller parts, yeah. Vociferous. That's how you say it. That's how you say it. Okay. Many African rulers mobilized external resources gained from supplying the expanded demand for slaves to counter internal threats to their Physiparis domains. This is in contrast to the conventional inside-out state-building path, whereby rulers mobilized internal resources to counter external threats, conquest by foreign powers. Specifically, these African rulers African rulers and would-be rulers use the increased returns from predatory violence to build armies and states, directly through conscripting slave soldiers in the trade for guns, and indirectly by using revenues and other foreign trade goods to pay off subordinates. Reflecting the fact that the expansion of the slave trade began earlier in Atlantic Africa than in East Africa, slaving states first arose in the early modern period in the former, but only in the 19th century in the latter. Dude, that's crazy. 19th century. That's the 1800s. Fourth, increased competition for captives in West and later East Africa tended to bring these predatory states into systemic, fiercely destructive military competition and exacerbated their brittleness. If one state grew more powerful by tapping the new opportunities offered by the expanded slave state, this posed a security dilemma for neighboring states. Because, because such states depended on a steady supply of slaves for their military and economic reproduction, internal cohesion, and geopolitical survival. Okay, sorry. Because I can read that sentence much better. Because such states depended on a steady supply of slaves for their military and economic reproduction, internal cohesion, and geopolitical survival, interruptions in the supply of slaves often started a self reinforcing cycle of disintegration. Thus, the slaving states were inherently brittle and unstable. Ah, it's in my notes. Jointly, therefore, these states constituted a violent and unstable international system characterized by acute security dilemmas and negative sum competition, and fundamentally dependent on external trade in slaves and slave produced goods. Um, are we still in the initial conditions? Oh my god, no, we're still in the abstract. I just realized. Okay. Uh um what new light does the story shed on general theories of wait, hold on actually. Sorry. I gotta check on doggies. Only check on doggies. Okay. What new light does the story shed on general theories of state building in international politics? In Europe, the conventional understanding is that external military pressures and Darwinian interstate competition. What is Darwinian interstate competition? Bro, we use like I mean, is it evolutionary? Is that like an actual thing or Darwinian interstate competition refers to the application of Darwinian evolutionary principles, like survival of the fittest and natural selection, to the behavior of sovereign states. It's really easy to apply to Africa. Anyways, Darwinian interstate, force rulers to mobilize internal resources via setting up a self-reinforcing cycle. In Africa, oh wait, that's so funny. This is how you know I'm not paying attention when reading. It literally says in Europe, the conventional understanding was Darwinian interstate competition. I'm so dumb. In Africa, by contrast, it was external resources, those obtained in exchange for slaves as commodities in their production, that were increasingly essential for countering internal obstacles to state formation. As a result of the combination of long-standing internal weaknesses, heightened security competition, and external resource dependence, African slaving states, despite their highly militarized character, were more brittle. Sorry, the way I bend my neck is so dumb. Let me fucking fix my form real quick, bruh. Come here. Where the fuck I stop off it? Okay. Were African slaving states, despite their highly militarized character, were more brittle and unstable than their European counterparts. Collectively, these features rendered the continent vulnerable to imperial conquest and colonization. Turning to contemporary and global conflicts, a threat of continuity between pre and post colonial state formation within and beyond Africa is the degree to which internal threats are often more dangerous than external ones, and to which state formation depends on external resources. Okay. Um, to this extent, Africa's early historical experience with outside in or second image reversed state formation is pre-consciously modern. Um Second image reversed. What the fuck, bro? Bro's getting real descriptive with these. Um in contrast to slave-based examples discussed in this paper, however, The relatively, yeah, the relatively benign environment of contemporary international politics allows brittle post colonial states to endure. Evidence here demonstrates not only that outside in state formation can occur in insecure international environments, but also that the interaction of such strategies can accentuate this insecurity. Variation within Africa, however, is as important as these general trends. The examples of Dahomey, which I in Segu in West Africa, demonstrate how the massive expansion in the slave trade stimulated the rise of slaving states in the 18th century. In East Africa, the later rise of the Omani Swahili and other slaving states is linked with the 19th century expansion of the Indian Ocean slave trade. Dahomey and the Omanis largely managed both the systemic security pressures and the transition in the nature of the slave economy until they were conquered by European imperialists. In contrast, Segu and others succumbed to the combination of external pressure and the inherent vulnerabilities of this form. Throughout this period, the multitude of stateless societies in Africa were also often crucially shaped by the slave trade, though their experience lies outside the scope of this paper. Okay. The argument here follows conventional usage in adopting Charles Tilley's definition of states as coercion wielding organizations that are distinct from households and kinship groups and exercise clear priority in some respects over all other organizations with substantial territories. That's a like a fair, I feel like that's a fair definition for a state in a way. Yeah, I feel like that makes sense. Peace. What time are we on? Only like 22 minutes deep. How long is initial conditions? Doesn't seem that long. Okay. The expansion of slavery. See, oh, geez, yeah, the expansion of fucking text. Jesus fucking Christ. Okay. Initial conditions for state building in pre-colonial Africa. A fundamental difference between the theoretical presumption of international relations scholarship, and African experience was that for long periods of African pre-colonial history, anarchy was more a domestic problem than an international one. Rather than there being a domestic sphere of authority constituted by vertical chains of command, and a threatening outside environment of unrestrained competition, area specialists and historians have shown that the main neck, please. Okay. Area specialists and historians have shown that the main ordering problem was often at home, where loose domains were held together to the parentheses to the extent that they were held together bilateral ties. Ooh. Though external threats certainly existed until the rise of the slaving states, international anarchy was relatively less threatening because of the reduced salience of territorial conquest. The reduced salience? What does salience mean in this? Salience refers to the state or quality of an object, idea, or stimulus relative to its environment. What the of territory? So the reduced quality of territorial conquest because it was less threatening, I'm guessing. Okay. Pre-colonial Africa was no less violent than Europe, but internal warfare, succession and secession struggles, rebellions and civil wars were more common and more dangerous than international wars of conquest. Building on the pioneering work of area specialists, I begin by explaining the scarcity and difficulty of controlling people, in the oh fuck dude, I it's literally I literally just said it. Visiparis or why can't I think of how to pronounce it? Visip Fissiparous. Yes, okay. In the fissiparous nature of African states. In general, and relative to their European peers, African states were more composite entities, depending on indirect rule with fuzzy frontiers and overlapping heteronomous authority claims. The idea that internal threats of disintegration commonly dominated external threats of conquest is then supported with four brief examples from four different periods and regions of sub-Saharan Africa involving a mix of actors along the River, just south of the Sahara in the late 16th century. In Angola, Congo, slightly later, along the Zambezi River in East Africa. In Southern Africa, and Southern Africa in the 19th century. The point of choosing such widely dispersed examples is not to suggest that these trends were unvarying universals in Africa, but to argue that they were common, recurring patterns that reflected similar underlying drivers. The link between war making and the development and reproduction of political structures was as intimate in Africa as it was in Europe, but took a very different form. Some of the most important differences stemmed from the low population density of Africa compared with Europe. Because land was relatively plentiful, but people relatively scarce, wars were more commonly about control of the latter than the former. Because there were few fixed investments in land, territory was often not worth defending, and so frontiers were usually loose zones. As Herbst put it, pre-colonial African states, therefore, had precisely the opposite physiology of many in Europe. The power assets were concentrated in the center with gradations. Gradations, is that what we're going with? Gradations or gradation? What the bro? Why did he say it so weird? Okay, wait. Can I hear that one more time? Gradations. A gradation refers to a gradual systemic progression of a series of successive changes taking place in stages or degrees. Bro, I'm learning like so many fucking new words right now. What the fuck? I just want to put like maybe like may words. Visiparis salience. Gradation. Sorry, I'm kind of a word fiend, so like I kind of love it. I love this type of shit. Um because territory is often not worth defending, so frontiers were usually loose ends. The European model, placing lower priority, placed control into territories, also a lack of concern. Oh yes, in the center with gradations of authority extending to the hinterland. What the fuck is the hinterland? The hinterland. Sorry, I just need to text something real quick. Nations of authority extending to the hinterland. The European model of placing significant assets in the hinterland to protect against outsiders and to make the boundaries real was neither viable nor relevant. The lower priority placed on control of territory also explains African rulers had precisely the opposite. The power assets were concentrated in the center, with gradations of authority extending to the hinterland. The European model of placing significant assets in the hinterland to protect against the lower priority placed on control of territory also explains African rulers' lack of concern about the European outposts scattered along the coast from 1500. These rulers could have expelled the Europeans, and sometimes did when it suited their interest. What the fuck are you doing? Internally, authority often radiated out in a series of are you fucking trying to chase your tail? Why do you keep bumping into the bed? Go, Biscuit. Your moms will take you outside. Internally, authority often radiated out in a series of concentric uh, concentric circles from a political core. Authority over sub-rulers became increasingly attenuated as the distance from the core increased, with vassals and oh my fucking god, bro. What are all these words? Suzerain? Suzerain is highly acclaimed political simulation, and that's not what it is. That's not what it is. Not. It's not a highly acclaimed political simulation and text-based RPG. What the fuck? Wait, hold on. A sovereign or state having some control over another state that is internally autonomous. Okay. And how do you pronounce this? Suzerain. 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 Um Authority over subrules became increasingly attenuated as the distance from the core increased, vassals and suzerain giving way to the occasional payment of tribute. Especially in areas where transport was possible only by foot, the difficulty of communication and control forced a high degree of reliance on various forms of indirect rule. In this regard, African states were akin to Nexon and Wright's conception of empires as rimless hub and spoke systems, rather than fitting the conventional understanding of the sharply bordered sovereign state. As one historian puts it, African states resembled the spokes of a wheel, whereby the center delegated power to provincial governors who were frequently military overlords with more or less direct links to the kingship. The reliance of autonomous intermediary rulers and the mobility of populations gave many African states a fissiparous character. They love this fucking word. Nominally, I love this fucking word. Nominally, subordinate rulers often politically or physically distance themselves from their erstwhile overlords, with larger kingdoms often fracturing or dissolving as a result. Whereas in European Elias argues that a competitive monopoly mechanism and a royal mechanism work to both centralize the control of violence and bind social groups increasingly close together within larger units. African states were much more likely to retain a composite character. Central rule was relatively thin and fragile. African states were much more likely to retain a composite character. Central rule was relatively thin and fragile overlay covering subunits. Central rule was a relatively thin and fragile overlay covering subunits that were often the primary focus of loyalty and authority. Attempts to overcome this fragility could exacerbate it, as centralizing moves provoked resistance and exit from subunits. Even operating at the highest level of generality, it is important to acknowledge the diversity of political forms in pre-colonial Africa. In particular, perhaps half the African population lived in thousands of stateless societies with populations numbering only in the hundreds. These communities interacted closely with larger counterparts over the centuries, but until the dawn of the 20th century, neither military nor economic dynamics produced their extinction. I think I'm going to end the reading here. I read more than what I did previously when I did this recording. And yeah, I'm tired as fuck. Thank you for being here with me, though. Thank you for being on this journey of information. I hope it was an interesting read. If you do really like it, please go check out the author and the particular article that they read. Remember, it's Something New Out of Africa. States Made Slaves, Slaves Made States. It's by J.C. Sharman. I hope you guys had a great time. I certainly did, and I can't wait to see you guys again. Love you. Bye.